Good afternoon. Welcome to another Delta DNA webinar. Today we're going to be looking at the topic of revenue validation, and I'll show you exactly how to use this feature to prevent hacked revenue invalid in-app purchases getting into your dashboards and polluting your data. First thing I'll tell you about is a little overview of how the revenue validation works and how we use it inside Delta DNA. Then I'll show you how to configure it in both taking the data from your App Store and how to use your transaction event to send us your receipt data, how to QA a transaction receipts, what the data looks like inside Delta DNA, and how you can then start querying it and filtering users based on their valid receipts. So basically, what we do with the revenue validation service, the prime purpose of it is to stop invalid transactions making a mess of your revenue numbers. So what we do, we're able to run a server-to-server request against the Apple App Store to check that the revenue transaction is indeed a valid one, it's not a forged one. And we then use that to exclude invalid revenue from your dashboards, as I mentioned, but we also flag it in the database so we can still see that transaction came through, and we can see but it was an invalid one, and we can actually subsequently then track that user and say we now know that user is on a suspect handset, they're on a hacked version of the game. So we could, if we chose to, do other things to that user. So the way it all works, this server-to-server request behind the scenes that we're making on your behalf, because it's coming from our server to Apple, it's very, very secure. The hackers can't get in amongst that and make a mess of it. So it's very, very secure. It's not something that can be changed from within the game. So what we need to be able to make this all happen is we need a small piece of information that will sit on your Delta DNA account, on your game account, that identifies, it really essentially just identifies your game ID, and we'll need the receipt that you get back from the App Store when an app purchase is made. We'll get that from the actual device themselves. So if I move to the next receipt, the next slide, receipts in the brain. Move to the next slide, and I'll show you a little bit more. So it is a server-to-server revenue validation, so it's very, very secure and very strong. Only genuine verified revenue will be displayed in the dashboards. We support the Apple App Store and the Amazon Store. We don't currently support the Google Play Store though, and there's a good reason for that. The way Google have implemented their service accounts would give us access to far more than just revenue validation on your game. It would actually give us the ability to disable your game or post new games on your account, and quite frankly that's a security concern that we don't really want to be a part of. So until Google implement slightly better service accounts for third parties to access services on your game, then we probably won't be supporting Google Play. However, the Google Play mechanism is very well done for you to validate the revenue yourself and on the handset and provide it securely to us. So there is a way around it. You can actually make sure that it's only valid transactions you're reporting to us on Google Play anyway, so not such a big concern. And just as I mentioned, because we're validating the revenue and actually setting up a flag against your users in the database, you can analyze it, interrogate it, and see which transactions were valid and invalid. Is there any patterns to it? You can even identify individual users. And should you want to target them with engage offers, modify the behavior of their particular game, make it more difficult, perish the thought, but you can do it if you want. So that's a kind of overview of how the revenue validation works. So the two pieces to the equation to get this all rolling, as I mentioned, are first of all, you need to set up inside the Delta DNA platform a link that tells us the ID of your game and what service we're validating against. So you'll see from this little slide, if you go into the game details page and edit it and scroll right down the page, there is a section where you can fill in which validation services you're using and the URL. The URL is always this by iTunes Apple Verify Receipt, and the ID is the game ID that you get from the iTunes Connect when you upload your game. That's just that game ID there. On the Deltatronics game, I want to edit the game details, and if I scroll down, you'll see in here I've got my, on the dev account, I'm validating against the receipt, the receipt verification service, and I've got my App Store game ID plugged in there, and I can turn that on and off at will, and I can set it up separately on my dev and live environments for both Amazon and Apple. The page, the iTunes Connect page that you get the ID from, you have to scroll quite far down. There it is, right down there in the general app information. And when you go to your app on the App Store, this number will actually be burnt into the URL as well when you go to your App Store page. It's generally a 9-digit numeric ID. So that's the two pieces of data that need to actually be plugged into Delta DNA to get the revenue validation working. The other thing you need to do is on the actual transaction events you're sending us, you need to provide two parameters, the transaction server and the transaction receipt. So imagine you could be multi-platform sending transaction events from Android devices, iOS devices, etc. So the transaction server is simply an enumerated value that says whether it's an Apple transaction or whether it's an Amazon one, etc. The transaction receipt is what comes back from the App Store, and this is a base64 encoded. It's a JSON that comes back from the receipt, and it's base64 encoded essentially. And what we do is we'll throw that at the verification service and check whether your receipt was valid. So just two parameters to send, and they will look. This has been shortened. The actual receipt itself will be a very, very long base64 string. If you want to find out more about what's going on behind the scenes and how it actually works, the link at the bottom of the slide will take you to the Apple receipt validation instructions and their developer account. And I'll just show you quickly. I think I had it actually there on my. Yeah, there we go. So if you look at this page here, that's the link that's in the slides. We'll put the slides up on the webinar page after this is finished, but this shows you basically how it's working behind the scenes, and it provides you, excuse me, with the URLs to the different receipt validation services that we're using. Okay. And what we can do once we've done that, we can actually check to make sure it all works. So if we want to send a transaction into the Delta DNA platform, we can use something like Slice and Dice or the event mining tools to pull the receipt back out and then use an external service like Hurlet or something to post to check what would actually come back. So if I go back to my PowerPoint slide, on the very next slide, there we go. So I can use something like Hurlet, and I can just form a piece of JSON and send that with the receipt data and the actual base64 encoded string. And it will. This is what the Apple service actually responds to us with. One thing to note: when you're using this, you will need, if you want to check it's all set up correctly, when you do the dev ones, they will need to be manually checked because the Apple Sandbox verification service actually doesn't respond in the same way that the live, the real one does. And the The reason for the difference is what we're doing, we're rather than just looking at what the receipt verification service comes back with and whether that's valid or not, we do some additional checks to make sure that the receipt it's coming back with, it actually belongs to your game. So you'll see in this particular example I've got highlighted on the screen here, we posted a receipt from a game to Apple, and they came back and said status 0, which indicates that's a valid receipt. Well done, thank you. But what Apple didn't know was, if you look at this item ID, the receipt was actually a receipt from a completely different game. So what we do is we actually check that when Apple come back to us and say this is a valid receipt from this game, we check that it is actually your game that the receipt was for. So that's why you need to actually manually check in your dev environment when you're setting this up at first, because the sandbox, Apple Sandbox, doesn't include the item ID in its response. So it'll come back, and the sandbox would come back and say this is a valid receipt, but not tell us what game it was from. So we wouldn't be able to confirm the identity. But if you do this with a real receipt from your live environment, you'll actually see what this comes back with will be valid, and what it will automatically happen on the platform, it will automatically validate as well. So that's kind of technically, that's probably more information than really you need, because that's what's going on behind the scenes. Once it's set up, we do all that completely automatically for you. And what happens when the receipts come back into us? We essentially put a flag against the transaction. We add an additional parameter behind the scenes. We add the revenue validated flag, and it's automatically appended onto each transaction event, and the value within that flag determines whether it was a good transaction or a bad one. So if it contains a value 0, it means the receipt wasn't validated. The reasons for this might be that you didn't provide a transaction receipt or a transaction server, or you hadn't set up or turned on the part in the game details page that I showed you earlier. It will come back with a 1 in it if your transaction validated successfully, and it will come back with a 2 if if Apple failed your validation. And only revenue validated values of 0 or 1 will end up in your dashboard revenue charts. So all failed transactions will be excluded, and you'll only be included if we either couldn't check or checked and you were good. So that's the quick 10-minute overview of how revenue validation works. The first time you do it, it's a bit confusing, but once you've done it, it's all right. The key things to remember are on the game details page, put your game ID in there, and on the transaction event, drop in the transaction receipt and the transaction server parameters. As always, if you have any questions about how to do this, or you get stuck as you're doing it, just use the support button on the website. If you got to help and support, it's up here right at the top. Just use the support button there to get in touch with us, and we can check things out for you. Alternatively, if you go into the help section, there's a reasonable amount of detail about this in the SDK section. So if I go into the iOS SDK, there's a little bit in there about it, and there's also additional details on the data structure in the direct access section. So if you're looking at how to get at the data and the revenue validation flag, it's in there. So you see inside the transaction event, there we go, there's a section transaction validation in here, and there's your transaction server and transaction receipt. The final thing today to kind of draw your attention to, and I alluded to this, was once we've actually got that flag set, the revenue validated 0 or 1, it means, as well as just keeping bad revenue data out of your revenue charts, you can actually choose to do other things with it. Because we have that flag set, if you wanted to build a segment that looked for any users who had ever had a revenue validated value equal to 2, so in other words, they'd ever sent you any transaction that was invalid, then yeah, you can build a segment that does that if you want. You can use that segment to then include or exclude these players from any of your dashboards. So you could, if you set this particular segment I got on screen, this is the hacked user, so it's looking for the last revenue validated value was equal to 2. Equally, it could be looking for the maximum revenue value. Revenue validated value is 1. So you could build a segment to either include or segment to exclude these hacked accounts, and you can use that in your dashboards. You can also use it pretty much all the way through the analyze section of the tools. So if I go back into my game, go to my live environment. So if I set up a hacked segment, hacked player segment, in my dashboards, I could use that to filter any of the dashboard charts by bringing it in up here in the segment filter. And likewise, if I go into the analyze section of the tools, if you're familiar with these, you'll know that just about all the tools in this analyze section do have segment capabilities. So here we are in slice and dice. I can filter by any of my segments, and in the funnel tool, it's up in the top right, up here. So pretty much anything in the analyze tools you can filter by player segments. So if you wanted, you can filter out the hacked users from any of your queries, any of your analysis queries. And if you really want to get vindictive, you could start using the targeting system to modify the game behavior, make the game 15% more difficult for hacked accounts. The choice is yours. So that's a kind of quick overview. The slide set for this will go up on the help site in the webinar section. So I hope that helps set up a receipt validation that you want to do. It's well worth doing. We do see quite a lot of hacked transactions coming through, a surprising amount of them. Thank you very much for attending, and speak to you again soon. Cheers.